Hello and welcome. I'm Jade Dupree, content producer and host for the Upstream Content Studio. We are pleased to host today's webinar in partnership with Kongsberg Digital, entitled Scaling Rapid, High-Quality Decisions with Digital Performance Models. Today's webinar is the first wave in the next pair of webinars in Kongsberg Digital's executive series to showcase why and how leaders must rethink digital transformation and advance towards the operating model of the future. We have Havard Ostensen leading the conversation as the moderator. He's the Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer at Kongsberg Digital and responsible for the execution of the company's global commercial strategy. With more than 17 years of experience in the integrated gas, LNG, and upstream industry, Havard is very well equipped to lead this discussion. Our speaker panel consists of two speakers. We have Grant Christie, Vice President of Business Transformation at Kongsberg Digital. He has over 30 years of expertise in senior leadership and strategy roles. He has been praised for being a visionary team builder in the energy industry and has been involved in developing the digital blueprint for LNG Canada. Joining Havard and Grant is Oscar Abink, Director of Energy, Technology and Innovation at S&P Global Commodity Insights. Oscar is responsible for analysis of the strategic implications of new technologies in the energy sector and leads S&P Global's upstream transformation, technology and innovation research. He is widely respected for his knowledge and global experience with upstream oil and gas, energy industry monitoring and trends, and oil and gas digitalization. Now, before I hand over to Havard, I would like to say that there is an option to submit questions for the Q&A throughout this webinar. If your question isn't addressed during today's session, we will hand the questions on to Kongsberg Digital to answer afterwards. From all of us here at the Upstream Content Studio, we hope you find this webinar insightful. Now it's my pleasure to hand over to Havard.
Thank you, Jade, for the introduction. Today's discussion will continue to build on the first set of webinars last spring in our executive series that shared knowledge and insights regarding why industry leaders are embracing digital performance models to execute their digital vision, to grow their business value, and to transform their businesses in response to the increasing pressures to become greener whilst ensuring their profitability, sustainability, and license to operate. Today's webinar will carry the discussion forward by focusing on a key challenge many executives are facing: how to achieve double-digit hard return on asset gains by scaling their digital effort while they are transforming. The good news is that forward-thinking companies are successfully scaling and achieving these gains today. In this spirit, today's discussion will center around three key factors to guide efforts in performing while transforming at scale. First, achieving scale and returns is all about decisions. Think digital decision-making. Second, it takes a holistic strategic approach that is stepped, not a big bang transformation. Think performing while transforming. Third, there are key essential shifts required when it comes to scaling for performance. We will discuss these critical shifts as well. Let's get started. I'd like to dive into our discussion with a question that is on the minds of many executives we talk to, which is, performing while transforming at scale with digital. Why is that so difficult? I'd like you to kick us off, Grant.
Hey, thanks, Håvard. I think there's three key areas which has really made this, challenging for the industry. The first one is a little bit of technology ahead of the promise. So early adopters have come in, and I think they've done a great job with the technology capabilities, and the technology has come forward leaps and bounds. But just really trying to apply the technology, people have focused it in on the problems or the challenges that they've seen immediately, and sort of applied it in a narrower sense. I think the second piece of this is digital is synonymous with data, and commensurate with the focusing in on the challenge, people have applied the technology on data and data transformation and data connectivity and serving it up for applications. And I think we've been awash in data in the industry. So the whole data focus has really, I think, overwhelmed the imperative to actually drive value at the end of the day. It's been focused more on the data with the belief that value will come out. And then the third piece is bringing these two themes together, which is the approach and the technology maturity has really lended itself to applying on narrower problems, trying to automate analytics as opposed to a more systematic end-to-end approach. And so the environment is maturing rapidly, but we definitely see, in our industry where we saw lean transformation, which is the end-to-end flow of value and accelerating the velocity through the business. We need that sort of digital approach, the equivalent of that digital approach from the lean transformation. And so I think a more holistic approach coming to the market is going to help alleviate some of the challenges we've had with applying digital and seeing value.
Very interesting. So we're washed with data. Obviously, the quantity of data is increasing, but this is about getting really purposeful about it and working end-to-end. Brilliant. So, Oscar, over to you. Performing while transforming at scale. Why is it difficult?
And thanks, Håvard, Grant, for inviting me to this interesting panel. Actually, it's a striking question, because one of the things we do at S&P Global, we organize workshops for our members, oil and gas digitalization workshops, and these members bring up questions forward that they would like us to look into. And actually, this is one of the questions: how do you scale up these digital transformations, these digital solutions? And so we looked into that in the last couple of months, by coincidence, or perhaps not by coincidence, but there's a couple of things that came out, and they're quite similar to what Grant said, but I want to alleviate them a little bit higher. Into a bit more abstract. So we saw four things happening that hamper scaling, bringing things from pilot to broad scale, as we call it. And so one thing is literally the value analysis. This is company install these pilots, they do these tests, and then they think, and they are, everybody's going to ask, what's the value? And I always give the analogy of, like, when you use a car navigation system or a map system on your phone, everybody uses that. It really helps. It's much more efficient. I use it almost daily to plan my routes somewhere, and nobody knows what the value is. I mean, there's not that I can say, oh, I saved so much money, or now I earn more. So that's one thing. The second thing actually is the development strategy itself. As I think Grant alluded to that. So there's always a question in companies: do we develop it ourselves? Do we buy it? How's the architecture around it, etc. And another thing that we see is the workflow changes. I think that, Grant, you touched on that too, but it's literally a lot of these digital solutions change the workflow, the way that people work in a company. And so that's another thing. And we actually saw companies retrenching back to old ways of working, despite new solutions being available. And finally, on the longer term, one thing that we noted is that companies implement these solutions, and these assets, when we look at the energy sector, whether it's plants, LNG plants, or it's oil and gas assets, or it's refineries, or it's even electricity plants, they last for 30, 40, 50 years. And so the first couple of years, everything's fine. 3, 4, 5 years down the line, you see these things sort of getting sort of out of date. There's always the phrase digital twins become digital cousins, and then they become distant family members. And so that whole support model is another thing that we find is challenging in the long run to make these solutions at scale last.
Mm-hmm.
Really interesting observations there. So, and you're alluding to something that I think, it will probably emerge here as a central theme, but changing the way you work is about a bit more than technology. It's about people adopting and the sustainment of that. So I'm sure we'll get more into that. Next question, and Grant, I'm going to ask you first. So I think it's very easy to come to an agreement that at the end of the day, business is about performance, and that as we see it, then companies that scale their decisions for bottom line impact, they win. So the price of slow, uninformed, and ineffective decision making actually costs the average S&P 500 company $250 million annually. It's an interesting data point. Why, Grant? Why do you think that is? And to keep it on the digital side, how do you think in today's world digital factors into this?
Yeah, no, and just to double click on one of the stats or one of the facts you shared with us on decision making. On that same study, I think they correlated decision quality is 95% correlated to financial performance of those S&P 500 companies. So, out of that study, it was really clear that companies that make higher quality, faster decisions win. So, in that vein, what we're seeing is when companies are looking at driving higher value and they start pivoting from just data transformation to more of a value theme, they tend to go for the high value problems, the high value decision making. And what we've seen and deployed these types of components in our environment, and they're immensely valuable. But what you see with high value use cases in particular is they tend to be more complicated. They tend to have more data feeds, more complex interactive data. They're more difficult and challenging to sustain. So they tend to be more complicated. They take more time to deploy. And an example would be autonomous power nominations, or some of the value chain optimization. They're immensely impactful for the business. But the focus on the technology and the focus on those high value problems, what we see is by their nature, they tend to be more bespoke. They tend to be more difficult to translate from asset to asset to asset. And they're definitely more difficult to sustain, especially for an emerging digital company, to Oscar's point on the sustainment point. So what we see is actually this, with a systemic approach, taking the focus away a little bit from the analysis and the automating of actions to thinking more about using digital to make a better decision, a higher quality decision. So rather than having an autonomous or automated, almost frictionless set of analytics or actions that follow from a decision, using digital to make a better decision, so I don't need to do those actions unnecessarily. So that does a couple of things for scale. First of all, it allows us to free up and declutter unnecessary work, unnecessary analytics, and free up some of the data requirements. And two, it allows you to move faster in the organization, making better decisions wins over trying to have the more efficient automated actions. And then finally, coming back to the decision, the focus of what problems we focus on, the high value, what we're seeing, and the trick here is to actually start on the other end of the scale, where we see focusing on high frequency, low value gives you a much better scale point. The high frequency focus on decisions is also, it frees up analytics. It frees up resources within an organization and across an organization, and they also tend to scale because of simpler data sets, simpler problems. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but those are the three things that we see that are impacting scale and deployment.
Interesting. So not the high value, which we often see companies go to when they sort of rank their priorities, but counterintuitively low value, high frequency. An observation here, we just had our own annual event in Oslo last week, and we had a speaker, Pascal Bornet, talked about how to utilize AI, and I think we were on the same vein, utilize artificial intelligence and digital to boost human capabilities so we can move up the value chain of decisions from the high frequency ones over to the more complex. Very interesting. Oscar, why is it so that this ineffective decision making is so costly, and how can, as you see it, how can digital help?
I think Grant already mentioned some very strong points. The one thing was sustainability we discussed. The other thing we see is the integration. I think, Grant, you touched upon that too. It's like you see a lot of sort of discrete solutions, and you miss sort of the more holistic value chain integration side of it, which allows you to oversee the whole sort of system and then make decisions. So you get what in past we would call that local optimization. So you have all these fantastic local discrete optimizations on specific issues, but then it's hard to see the actual value on the larger scale, in the broader system. And there's also more mundane things. I mean, there's technical issues, which is stymie the widespread development and the deployment, I should say, of solutions. So simply had different assets with different systems, etc. And there's more the organizational side. This is where the different organizational units sort of almost, in some cases, I wouldn't say refuse, but I find it difficult to adopt these things. And there is, I mean, we all know in our working in an industrial environment that there are people which are strong sort of believers in these solutions, and there are other people which are, less prone to take on these ones. And finally, there's the value capture itself. Sometimes it's just the organization doesn't allow, for whatever reason, the organizational structure around maintenance, around planning doesn't allow to make full use of that solution, and so there is the value, but it can't actually be captured for other reasons. So those are a bit more mundane reasons why we see this sort of difficulties with the scaling and decision and full scale decision sort of high. What is it? Sorry, blabbering here. This adoption to full scale around the decision-making process.
It's really interesting that you bring up the topic of structure, because obviously now the world is changing very fast in terms of digital and the capabilities out there. So it might, pose the question: are we structured correctly to be able to completely harness those capabilities and bring value to our organizations? Grant, in terms of today's approaches to digital, so to enable optimal digital decision making at scale, obviously it requires thinking about performance optimization and sustainment, as Oscar mentioned earlier, from the outset. Companies are taking some different approaches for doing this. So, Grant, what approaches do you see in the market today?
Yeah, thanks, Håvard. We recently did a survey and a study in the market, and a few strong form themes came out, that in terms of approaches. So, 65% of our respondents, they are heavily leaning towards co-innovation with their vendor partner, their technology vendors, and co-innovation also across their industry peers. So there's a growing recognition that this is a big challenge and too big for any one company to necessarily solve. And so there's a lot of potential to learn and bring a lot of heads together and solve it both from an organizational structure, technology, industry perspective. Yeah, another theme within that is going open APIs. So, it's also driving towards more common data standards. So a little bit like what happened with the ERP market, where people started to realize that there is a model company, there is an optimum way of doing some of these approaches, and that's not your competitive edge. Your competitive edge is really about your asset grouping and your strategic decision making and faster, high quality decisions. That's your strategic edge. The structure and the technology and all the rest of it is more of the requirements. So we're seeing more of a move towards this co-innovation and openness and sharing along the non-competitive parts. Bigger picture, the fundamental approach to date has really been transform the data as the dominant approach we see. Focus on data, focus on transformation, connection, make it and serving data up to applications. And then from those applications, automate actions, analytics to make people more efficient. So we talked about some of the pitfalls of that approach. What we're seeing come out, we saw this in the survey as well, is the difference between high return on assets versus lower return on assets for in our cluster analysis is the companies that are doing better are focusing on the whole spectrum of decision quality. So they're really looking at a more holistic approach. They're looking at the decision making, not necessarily the automation of actions. And the final piece is a real focus on return on assets. I think early days, a lot of games being played on return on investment, and that can be managed and manipulated in a number of ways. But when you start thinking about, am I having a material impact? It really brings focus to, is this scaling? Is it having a bottom line impact? So I think those are all really positive moves, moving towards decision making, moving towards return on asset focus, and really making sure that it's impact at scale. At the moment, though, it's the predominant approach I think is evolving, which has been data, apps, people, and so I think we're going to move beyond that.
Yeah, that's I mentioned we had our own annual event last week, and we surveyed the participants and what really they found interesting, and co-innovation and being able to discuss the issues more at a systemic level was the number one thing that resonated with the audience. I feel that also myself, that this co-innovation is really becoming an elevated topic. Oscar, you obviously talk to a lot of different types of companies, different operators and so on. Thinking about optimization and sustainment in this context, what approaches do you see in the market?
Yeah, it's interesting that how different organizations or different people can interpret the same question differently. So when I heard this question, I thought we have quite a framework about how we see companies going through this digital transformation, and particularly in the energy sector. And there's different approaches, literally. So the one thing, and so I'm going to take it a slightly different, more abstract frame into more abstract framework. So the one thing that we see a lot happening is what we call the big bet companies. So there's a number of companies in the energy sectors that truly believe that digital is going to help increase their performance. They have made large commitments. They are apt to partner. There's often a C-level drive. So they have usually larger groups of the data scientists, but also they develop quite a number of solutions in-house or very closely with partners. Then we see a second group, which is a bit more pragmatic, and they're often around either business units, which specifically, resource classes or focus. If you talk about refinery, specific product focus, as you can think of like Australia LNG, for instance, or some of the unconventional companies in the US. or they focus around specific functions, whether it's like specific refinery functions or drilling or these kind of things, production, reservoir engineering. And finally, there's a group of companies which we used to call the existential crisis. Though those are the ones who are in particular hit by the various downturns in oil and gas prices. Started actually, with the financial crisis in 2008-9. Then, of course, the big downturn in oil and gas prices 2015. Again, during the pandemic, and they really focus on digital to help survive. We now call them North Stars. So some of the unconventional companies in the US are that way. They really develop solutions very quickly, implement them, roll them out over the whole organization. They're often more advantaged because they have one specific resource class, one specific domain that they work in. There's also a couple of operators, for instance, in the North Sea or in Asia that follow that route. The challenge with all these different models, they have their pros and cons. You clearly see the big bets is a longer term one. The value generation takes longer, and that makes it sometimes more complex for them to keep up and keep the spirit going on. For the functions, it's more difficult to roll it out or the business unit between different assets, because the deep water assets in oil and gas is very different in a way from an onshore or unconventional asset. So many of the solutions are not compatible. And finally, as I said, these North Star companies, those are the ones that we find most successful because they do look at the whole value chain, and they look at the decision-making process as core part of their business, almost survival. So different approaches with different companies. That's what I in short would say.
Very, very, very interesting, and it's very interesting that you highlight that when companies, and you're highlighting those that are sort of under a degree of pressure and feel the sort of existential context around it, they embed digital into their business, and then they become more successful. So it's a very, very interesting observation there. I'm going to stay with you, Oscar, for a minute here, and talking about adoption. This is a lot of the questions that we get is, okay, well, if we do this as a project, how do we then continue sustaining this? How do we ensure that the uptake and the adoption of digital is happening at the appropriate scale for these companies? So I'd like to ask you your reflections on this. How can we tackle that issue successfully?
It's a very good question. This is actually one of the key questions for our workshop. And, as we discussed, there's not clearly one silver bullet, one key solution. And I think, Grant, you said it now, it's a silver shotgun, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
You go. We do see a couple of sort of streams or themes coming out when we look at the entire energy landscape. One is relatively, I wouldn't say it's not actually, it's very complex, but it's non-technical. It's more around organizational alignment. So you do have solutions. You're changing your organization for some cases. I'm thinking of like a business unit that was dealing in gas. At one point, gas prices went really low. They had to demand their assets simply because they couldn't afford so much offshore staff. And at that point, you see that there's a big reorganization going on. They're able to implement digital systems to help them with maintenance, do a different maintenance approach. So also the KPIs change, the structure of the organization, but down to actual a person or people level. And so that's where you see digital solutions being rolled out throughout an organization. So that's one thing. The other one, what I find particular interesting is when people use what we now call nowadays integrated operation centers or remote control centers. There's just different terms, but when there's a central location where a lot of data and information comes in, and there are supervisors or technical staff looking at it, when they combine it with their technical support staff, so the ones who actually develop and implement or buy and implement solutions. And so there's often a trusted relationship between the different assets across the world and this center together with its technical support staff. And so when new solutions come up, they're able to roll those out, push them basically, or offer them to the different assets, and at the same time get very quickly feedback on what works and what doesn't. So that's one of the more efficient one. We don't see that much in practice actually. Both these, when you talk about organizational alignment and these cross-asset integrated operation centers, they need digital platforms. They need some kind of system where the solutions are being developed, where the data comes in, is being contextualized, etc. And that's actually the third big route that we see at the moment. I'm heavily involved, as you know, in digital twin research, so that's where we see a lot in the energy sector having a large focus. And so what we mean by that, there's, as I said, there's data information. You already said that too, Grant. There's a digital sort of platform integration, middleware layer, contextualizing the data, etc. And then finally there's applications and dashboards on top of that. And that system, once it's being implemented, is a very strong sort of enabler for large scale deployments. And again, to give you the sort of the retail space example, when you talk about Android or iPhone, that's a clear system. There's all the applications are in one environment. The data is in one environment, and so it's an easier example, but it's that's something that I think we're striving also in the energy sector at the moment. So these digital platforms are the ones that are playing a key role at the moment in deploying solutions at scale.
Very, very interesting, and I really appreciate when you're bringing up the trust and building a support framework for perhaps global sets of assets, scaling it out by providing value. That the center of excellence model has been in place for a long time, and obviously now with digital technologies, we might be able to scale that out even further. But it's also interesting that you're saying that you're not seeing so much of that. So, Grant, why these adoption challenges, in your opinion?
Yeah, so the adoption challenges. So I just want to pick up on a couple of points, and I think Oscar, I love your analysis on this. Whenever none of these components around an operating model, from the technology to the processes to the metrics to the performance culture to the accountability and governance model and the structure, all of these work as a system, and so none of them can be individually manipulated without impacting the others. So this is sort of some of the work that I do with our clients and early stage clients, is thinking through the blueprint, thinking through not just the initial deployment and how do we get the value up and running, but where does this take you, so that it's done deliberately, it's done in a way that the organization can step into and grow the muscles to sustain and make sure that they see the bottom line impact. So the decision or the operations center, a lot of that capability, I completely agree. It's enabled by a technology layer, and what we see is where those work really, really well is when you really think through scale. What's common? And I come back to the high frequency, low value. You're better off, and this is the whole lean transformation world and unconventional as well. A rapid outcome and result and learning fast is and having that drive faster velocity through the organization is how you create momentum, build skill, and evolve your organization to adjust to the market. So definitely see that structural approach and that operating model approach, but really focusing on decisions that unlock and provide far greater scale. So the decision that ensures that actions are carried out at the right time, at the right frequency, and geared for scale, is critical. Important to target the transformation explicitly for scale. We have an 80-20 rule. 80% high frequency, low value, 20% some of the high value, low frequency use cases, but the vast majority is around that decision making for scale. And then the adoption. What we find some unintended benefits of the focus of the horizontal, we call horizontal decision making. So right from rather than converting all of a single silo capability, really closing the loop on decision making and enabling you to go from pattern to action to outcome, and then review and understand the analysis with those high frequency problems. It lends itself to the evolving technology. The high frequency is more data, more frequency of responses. Therefore, AI, ML, and these advancing tools become more powerful with this approach. And because they're low value, they tend to also be slightly less impactful. Impactful in terms of impact on the organization. They tend to have, tend to be able to apply these slightly without as much friction in terms of impact on the wider scale of the operating model. And you can evolve your way into working digitally. So you're trying to avoid the big bang, and you're really trying to put in place this closed cycle decision-making capability that allows you to start autonomizing some of these high frequency, low value decisions from the bottom up, and you declutter the workforce and you create more capability and capacity as you go. So we tend to find that as a transformational approach, alleviate some of the friction that allows companies to grow and brings focus to what data do I really need for the decision support. And therefore, I'm not over focusing on data transformation and therefore impacting sustainment.
Yeah, so I'm going to stay with you, and you're already on the topic, and we promised in the title of this webinar that we would touch on the digital performance model, right? So, and I think you're describing some of the key components here. But if you will share with our audience, please, what is a digital performance model, and how can a digital performance model drive double-digit bottom line returns today?
Yeah, thanks, Havad. And I feel like we've been dancing around the topic as we've been going through this. But I mean, this is as a result of a lot of deployments, wide-scale deployments globally, and a lot of industrial experience been brought to the mix. A digital performance model is really made up of two components, two core components. The first one is the performance aspect, the performance model. And the second component is around the high quality decision structure and the closed loop, driving a closed loop decision, a high quality decision process. So the digital performance structure is really geared in our DPM around connecting vertically through a series of cockpits, the financial results to the asset performance to the operational day-to-day tactical delivery. So lining up the key financial metrics down to the tactical measures and making sure that it's really crystal clear for the organization what decisions drive those metrics and how those metrics impact value. So, and just touching on a cockpit, that's not a word by accident. Cockpits in our vernacular, they bring together the metrics so you can see the gap. So a team can understand, the situational perspective on the decisions they need to make. But most importantly, within a cockpit, you have the ability to initiate action and have transparency on its progress and see the results of the decision that you made. So it's the closed loop decision making that really bringing that and being able to see that how it impacts the vertical performance of the organization. On decision quality.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, horizontal. So you're talking about horizontal decision making all the way from the data, so the data patterns to the outcome, and then vertical sort of visibility.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. And so I just want to, and we'll share a slide on this just so that you have the reference. But the closed loop decision is the second fundamental piece, where decision quality is really made up of 6 things, and the quality of decisions and the strength of decision is like a chain. It's only as strong as the weakest link. And so the six links. The first one is framing, so making sure it's crystal clear what decision needs to be made, and this is where the cockpits provide that value compass. The second element is making sure that you assess the alternatives, and this is where AI and the technology is really coming to the fore, coupled with simulation and analytics. So being able to rapidly put in front of people, these are the alternatives you have. This is what you've done in the past. This is the highest cost, the highest value solution, the fastest solution, the best mean time to failure solution. So it's really bringing that transparently and rapidly to the forefront. The third link in the chain is data. And this is where I think as an industry, we've focused on it because of technology and for all good reasons. But data doesn't make a good decision. It's the data that's premium and the platinum data is the data that's required to support the key decisions. So this DPM approach really provides a mechanism for organizations to focus their data transformation and data capture approach to really match to what drives value. The fifth component is metrics. Actually, fourth component is metrics. Being able to calculate real time, accurately, reliably, the metrics so I can assess the alternatives and understand the impact is the value of digital. The fifth component is logic and collaboration. Once again, a strength of digital. It's being able to share, tie in logic, analysis, analytics, constraints, being able to make that transparent to people so that I get robust decision making. And the final piece, and this is the most important to really realizing the value, is actually commitment to action. So this is the ability to be able to say, I've seen the pattern, I understand, validated it, I've looked at alternatives, the AI has made some recommendations, I've made my decision on what I think the best course of action is, I've collaborated on it, and then I right click, turn it into a work pack that I can then track, see right the way through and see the impact of the decision that I made. And so this closed loop is really what drives the whole performance, and then being able to link it vertically back to the strategic objectives. So once again, that's a lot of words to describe, but really the DPM, the digital performance model, it's rapidly deployed. For a smaller asset, it's weeks. For a large scale refinery, it's 3 to 4 months. It's coming. What we find is there's a template that goes behind it. There is pre-analytics we provide to help you identify the high value or the high frequency, low value decisions on where to start to have a more frictionless deployment. And then, seeing results quickly. We see this decision cycle because we focus on the nature of the high frequency, low value type problem set. We see benefit almost immediately out of the deployment. So it really does turn on the head, some of the perceptions of the digital programs taking years and lots and lots of money, to really focusing it in like the lean transformation and unconventional of like, how do I get higher velocity decision making, higher quality, using the technology where it really makes an impact. Things like AI, putting it into context, data transformation, putting it into context so it drives a bottom line result.
Thanks, very, very comprehensive answer there, Grant, and we'll be sure to share content so people can self-educate on this as well. Oscar, this you alluded to it earlier, how companies under some pressures were able to restructure and change the ways that we're working. Obviously, this will require some shifts, the ability to transform optimally at scale to drive performance. What type of shifts are required in the industry to adopt this?
Thanks, Håvard. And before I answer that one, or in the positive way. I just want to mention one in the negative way, and think, because Grant and I both grew up in the time that we would call digital oil fields of the future, these large sort of DOF programs, or they were called smart fields or I fields or intelligent fields or field of the future or operations of the future, whatever. And so the one thing I think the shift that is no longer required is this tremendous large programs that we saw, basically about 15, 20 years ago, that where companies were trying to integrate everything with everything and correlate everything with everything. And that is something you mentioned the term closed loop, so that brought it into my mind again, Grant.
Yeah.
That is where literally they're trying to get all kinds of data in literally all the data types into one system and then trying to optimize everything. That didn't work, and I think we still are in the impression that it's maybe in the future something will like that will happen, but at the moment we're still much more in a sort of more focused situation. So and that then brings me to what do we see as being companies? Grant, you already mentioned the unconventional companies in the US. There's a couple of other ones out there. It's simply continuous improvement mindset. That both leadership as well as basically most people in the company have to be aware that you continuously need to improve. So you can't just stand still and you have a solution and it works and that's it. And you have to go on and look for that next step. And so digitalization is a key enabler in that. But it is just an enabler. So it's really the mindset of that. We don't see that in some companies. You have that, and I think everybody has it sort of in back of their mind. To actually make it work throughout the company is quite challenging. One thing that helps with that is when you think of this question of what kind of industry shifts are required, you see that there's a lot of good solutions out there already. I mean, you mentioned that, Grant, in the system. And so it's whether it's around optimization of pumps or routine equipment or maintenance, there's built on that, and then try to integrate and automate those and bring them across the whether it's the full company or it's specific assets, etc. But then distribute them in a broader sense. So I think that, but in particular, this continuous improvement mindset, I think we all speak to it, but when you actually look into what companies are doing, sometimes there's still sort of conflicting views, let's call it that way, how to how to fully deploy that throughout the whole organization.
Fantastic. And we're covering a lot of ground today. So I'm coming up on the last question of this session, and we probably should try to keep our answers relatively brief now, as we've really elaborated on these topics. But if we talk about how to access the future, and thinking about performing while transforming at scale, starting by digital decision making and enabling digital decision making across thousands of decisions daily, by organization across locations, across the globe, COEs to the field, etc., with digital performance models. Let's wrap up by asking, why do you believe implementing a digital performance model at scale is the future? Grant, would you like to answer first?
Yes, certainly. It's the old adage of, if you want different results, you need a different approach. So, and I think it's not necessarily per se a different approach, but I think an evolved approach. A lot of the work that's been done to date and a lot of the capability that's been built up, it's about channeling that into really driving scale and really driving, thinking about the decision making and the clock speed of organizations. How do I make it higher quality and faster? So I think bringing that mindset, open collaboration about what's not strategic or not necessarily competitive, but and being open-minded and bringing those those open API thoughts and mindsets and to the party, I think is key. And it's the way the business is going, the industry is going. The companies that move faster, collaborate, learn faster, and make high quality, faster decisions win. So I don't think it's a case of, an option. I think it's just the direction that the industry and competitors need to go. The second thing is it's around, bringing the people along, and, the big bang transformations that we've seen in the past, finding a way, and this is where the DPM with its scale factors, both within an organization, across assets and across an organization, and starting from the low value, high frequency stuff at the bottom of the organization, it's a Lego brick approach. So it allows you to grow, scale, and to your point, Oscar, the whole continuous improvement. It lends itself extremely well for you to mature autonomous, high frequency, low value decision making, and then move it up and create capacity for your organization. Use the technology to enable people, is going to bring them along and show results quickly. So think of getting results back in months, single digit months. Being able to unlock that, competitors that are unlocking that around their decision making, I think it's not a case of if you go down this journey. I think it's just a case of when and how to get started.
Oscar, driving performance through a digital performance model. I'll leave you with the last words on this. Why
and I fully agree with Grant. I just want to take it a little bit broader. I mean, so there's basically, it's almost like a push and a pull situation, right? At the one point, there's this push of digital in the sense that, low cost sensors, IoT, connectivity, everything's increasing. So there's this sort of push, this wave of digital technologies, digital sort of capabilities moving towards us. And it's very hard to ignore that. I mean, in our daily life, when you talk about mobile phones, even what we're doing today with this webinar, that it's very hard to ignore that. At the same time, you see that the digital sort of solutions, the digital possibilities become bigger and bigger. This, the AI, the Gen AI is kicking in at this moment. We've seen digital twins some years ago coming in. So there's all these sort of almost, capabilities coming in. And finally, there's the companies, there's an increasing need and almost unavoidable increasing need for reduction of inefficiencies. So you have to become more efficient as a company, and whether it's going to be in your greenhouse gas emissions, your energy use, your use of materials, let's say the deployment of people in your business. A simple example in the Netherlands, so where I'm from, we're talking about replacing gas-fired boilers with electricity. You need engineers, you need maintenance people to do that. You simply don't have those, and so you need to go to smarter solutions in those cases. And the same is with the industry, with aging assets. So it's a mammoth anchor that it's going that way, and it's every company will be pushed into this direction of some kind of digital solution, digital performance model.
Excellent. I see that we have time for a couple of audience questions. And the first one, I think, is for you, Grant, and it's about AI and comparing that to a digital performance model. Specifically, there's a lot of buzz about AI and using it to provide recommendations and decision support. How is that different from DPM, or is it the same thing?
Yeah, so a super relevant question for the day. As we see new technologies, learning from the past, the bolt-on versus thinking about the technologies more systematically. AI is undoubtedly an immensely powerful capability, and it has once again the digital promise. What we see with AI is, if you think through decision quality, there's areas where undoubtedly it creates greater insight, faster analysis, assessing alternatives, understanding constraints, and the ability to be able to condense and summarize and present a lot of information in a meaningful way is extremely powerful. But once again, decision making is a chain, and it's only as strong as its weakest link. So absolutely, it will help clock speed of organizations. Absolutely, it'll help quality of decisions in an organization, but it needs to be applied in a framework where you think about the whole quality of the decision, so that we don't make the same we don't go down the same road that we went with data transformation, where we've AI does not necessarily on its own make higher quality decisions faster. It can do if it's put in the right context. So I think it's complementary. I think the recommendation, using it for recommendations, understanding alternatives is powerful, but you need the whole decision frame, closed loop decision cycles to really realize the full promise and the benefit. And and the benefits are there. We see them in terms of double-digit return on asset improvements. So it needs to be put in context.
Excellent. Oscar, here's one for you on talent. And obviously this is top of mind. We hear it all the time. How do we attract and retain the right talent so we can be equipped for digital transformation? Some companies have a more traditional long-term employment strategies, and are those approaches changing now?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's an excellent question, Overt. And every company that has, in particular around data science, AI, but also development, developers, etc. There's this big struggle for talent in the market, and so there's a bit of separation going on. There's sort of divergence going on. On one hand, you see in particular with the I wouldn't say older, but one particular group is looking for, as you said, more stability, long-term contracts. We more and more see companies establishing entities where people can do projects, and you see, in particular, younger people moving from project to project. I wouldn't fully call them digital nomads, but they do tend to not work from an office, or not so much, and engage a lot in digital through digital means, social media, etc. And so I think that more and more both systems will need to be next to each other to maintain sufficient digital capability in your company. And so actually the question is, can you attracting people? Yes. Projects, interesting, has actual working on solutions that will help the world or help the energy sector. Retaining employees, maybe that will be less in the future, because they will not always be employees. They will just be people working on projects for you. So that whole retaining thing, then maybe it's a bit less traditional, but maybe that word will in the end disappear to some degree.
Very, very, very interesting dynamic there. Okay, last question, and it's a big one, and I'll ask this to both of you. So we start with you, Grant. Advice to leaders. What action should leaders take to best position their companies so they can perform while transforming?
Indeed, a big question.
It's a huge question.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the meaning of life. But I think, having been in roles in my past where I've led organizations, I think there's a degree of be ready to be open your mind if you want different results. Be ready to learn and really think about what is truly your differentiation, and everything else. How can you collaborate? How can you better use the capability, skills, and the talent that you've got, and then go and be open, collaborate, bring in the vendors. The games of battleships of not telling your vendors exactly what exactly is going on and expecting the solution you want has never really worked out well. So I think it's this bringing forward this open mindset is imperative. And then the transformation, we know what big bang is, higher risk. There are other ways with digital where there's high learning frequency and deploy rapidly, see results early, quickly, gets people on board. I think it's the mindset of set the expectation of how do we close the loop rapidly and get decision quality and the clock speed faster. And then, don't be afraid to challenge some of the existing thinking, so the IoT point came up. In a digital world, we actually see the requirement for IoT going down, but being way more creative with how you actually get the data and the insights, and using analytics in a far more digital way, thinking how to work digitally with a digital asset, as opposed to traditionally where I would just go and measure everything everywhere. So, just think about mindsets and biases, be open, and expect and gear for scale and bottom line value out of the gate.
Oscar, your advice to leaders.
Okay, my last. So I just want to say, this personal perception here is not per se S&P Global opinion, but the one thing, I already mentioned that be careful with very large programs. So that these huge, humongous company-wide programs where trying to integrate everything within everything. That's one thing. The other thing is a bit more sort of obvious is and I think Grant, you mentioned that also, is you should tailor your strategy, your digital transformation strategy, always to your company sort of settings, and it's both the operational domain you're working in, so what type of resources or assets, etc., but also the culture you have. So some things you can do in some companies and others you can't. I mean, if you talk about oil and gas companies, there's some are very exploration focused and some are more production, very traditional focused. It is different approaches. And the other thing is really for leaders. So one thing in my personal career I've seen in the last 2 decades, or a little bit longer actually, around digital transformation, is that the sort of hey, you have this fail fast, etc. So accept failure, but it's not so much that you have to accept failure or risk, but it's more that you don't punish people for it. So allow things to go wrong and don't take it out directly on staff, because that creates quite a difficult situation to progress. And so that's one. And finally, realize that this is a challenging topic. I mean, we've been discussing this, how to do this. I think the first wave of digitalization I was in was actually when I was doing my PhD in the 90s. And when we went from paper to seismic and on screens, and we were with disk, and you got like a huge, seismic survey, and it was on 15 different disks, and you had to load them all into a computer, and it would take hours and hours, and then it still wouldn't work. And so now that's all behind us, but rolling these solutions out on scale throughout an organization has been, a challenge for the last couple of decades. So don't expect it to go away in in a snapshot now, but so be aware of that. At the same time, we're making good progress. I mean, we are more efficient. We're doing much more with what we could do 10 or 20 years ago. So it's definitely positive vibe, but just be aware that it is challenging.
I think that's a great summary, and that is what we have time for today. Thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Grant, for all these great contributions. And we will, of course, share more content down the line so people can read up themselves on some of these topics. So let's summarize. The current approach to digitalization in the energy industry is struggling to deliver meaningful scale and the promised impact. Yet, senior energy executives will be expected to run their businesses digitally at scale while managing pressures from board members, shareholders, regulators, and society. At Kongsberg Digital, we have witnessed the exponential value digitalization can deliver at scale by transforming up to 15 assets per year for some of the world's largest oil and gas companies. And we believe that the digital performance model is the viable alternative to leading a future business as data becomes more critical to running a business. Ultimately, when it comes to digital, the choice is yours. You can stick with the tactical digitalization that has ceilings on returns due to ineffective decision quality, guiding decisions and resulting actions, or you can embrace the transformative change for exponential performance gains at scale with the digital performance model within 6 to 12 months. With that, I'll hand it back over to the Upstream Content Studio.
Thanks, Havard, for taking us through this webinar. You've been a great host throughout today's session. And thank you to both our speakers, Grant Christie and Oscar Abing, for their insights today. This concludes our first webinar in this two-part series on scaling rapid, high-quality decisions with digital performance models. Today's discussion focused on why rapid, informed decision-making enabled by a holistic, end-to-end digital approach is fast becoming the most important competitive advantage for businesses today and will only become more critical. To learn more, you can download a digital performance guide that summarizes how to ensure all dimensions of decision quality are factored into every decision at every location across your business using a digital performance model. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.